The open source movement is fundamentally incompatible with the free software movement. Now, I want to address this. The technicalities of what the open source movement stand for in the development of the software themselves are compatible with the free software movement. However, when the open source idea is taken and made into a social movement, that is what is incompatible with the free software movement. Now, I go around the internet and look at these big content creators or influencers or internet personalities or whatever you want to call them, and lots of them use the terminology open source. And I find that to be a big problem, not only because of the obvious lack of people who promote freedom, but also because lots of these content creators, they also put on the appearance as if they also are somewhat in support of the free software movement to varying extents. Of course, it depends on the content creator, the specific one in question, of course. But even the ones who claim that they would support the free software movement in some way, they still, for the most part, use the open source terminology. And that seems to be a rather widely popular way of doing things. I have heard it called that there is, quote, mixing between the movements, unquote. And frankly, I would say that that is very unfortunate and it should be avoided as much as possible. See, here's the thing. Richard Stallman has explained it really well. The terminology that you use is like a banner that you wave for the social movement you support. In that, if you use the terminology free, libre to refer to the software, you are waving the banner of the free software movement. When you use the terminology open source to refer to the software, you're waving the banner of the open source movement. And this is the reason why I think that there is a lot of importance to the terminology here and why I make such a big fuss about this. Because it really is important. The terminology is not just a generic word. You see, open source is not just a generic term in the English language that refers to the software. No, open source is a specific term used by a specific social movement to refer to the software that qualifies and meets the standards set by their philosophy. It is not a generic term in the English language that refers to those sorts of softwares. Here's a big thing. When some content creator or anyone else says that the reason they would use the term quote open source unquote is because it's the popular one, that like it's more recognized or it's more has more public support or something, I say that's a nonsense reason. You see, the real reason you use the terminology you use is because of your own values and your own preferences, your own views. Whatever other nonsense you use to justify it is just rationalization. The reason you say open source is because you support the open source movement. No other reason. That, or the one exception. If you are talking from a genuine ignorance, if you are genuinely not aware and you don't know any better, and you're just using the wrong terminology simply because you just don't know any better, then yes, you might indeed be using the wrong terminology just by accident because that's the one that's popular, so that's the one you've heard, so that's the one you use. So yeah, that could be the case. But the moment you come aware of the two movements, the free software movement and the open source movement, and that there is a difference, then it is no longer the case that you're just using that term because that's the popular one. If you are aware of both of them, and you say one of those terms, you have to pick a side inherently. You are picking one. Now, unless you want to be neutral and you want to specify somehow that you are neutral, so you have to basically disclose your neutrality. You could say something like, they like to use that, there's the free libre open source software, so like FLOSS would be an acronym for it. You know, if you say that, then you can be neutral and you can talk about those sorts of softwares in a neutral manner. But if you pick one, you pick either free libre or open source, then you are inherently going to have to pick one or the other. So you are going to be siding with one of the movements. And even if you say that you don't necessarily agree with the views, well, that's the banner you're waving. So even if you don't agree with them, well, that's what you're promoting. So, if anything, if you don't agree, well, then you should absolutely not support the wrong movement. But yeah, for the most part, I would like to say that those people actually do agree with the terminology they use. So, what is the actual problem then with the open source movement? Why is it incompatible with the free software movement? Well, fundamentally, the open source movement as a social movement, it takes the values of open source, the idea of the philosophy, and then makes a social movement out of that. So basically, those are the core values. The ideas of the open source idea are the core values of the open source movement. So the fact is, there you have a social movement with a specified set of core values, and those differ from the core values of the free software movement. So already inherently, two social movements with two different philosophic core values, they are already fundamentally incompatible from the start. But even more so, not just the fact that they have different core values, but also the core values are also in conflict with each other. You see, when the social movement, well, rather, when open source as a social movement sets up a worldview that applies to the area of life that it talks about, that is in its entirety the worldview. So this means that when you compare the open source movement to the free software movement, you can see that the free software movement talks about ethics. Ethics are at the very core of the free software movement. They are fundamental values. So the fact that these ethics are missing from the open source movement means that in effect the open source movement is making a statement by omission. They are declaring that in their worldview the ethical questions do not exist. They are irrelevant, they do not matter. Or just like I said, they outright don't exist. They are not a concern of the open source movement. That is therefore fundamentally incompatible with the free software movement, because the free software movement is driven from the fundamental assumption of those values that it has. So you might then question this, well, does the open source movement need to be some all-encompassing worldview that has an answer to every question that a person might have in life? Well, of course not. But if you then think that, well, just because it doesn't say anything about the ethics doesn't mean that it's against the ethics, that like so if it's missing, well, perhaps the free software movement could fill that gap and like they could work together and all that stuff. But again, I say that is nonsense, because fundamentally the core values are the core values. You're not going to be able to just fill in some missing gap. Like, no, there is no missing gap. It's just not there. It's not a part of it. Like, that's what you need to understand. The open source movement, its values are the values it has. The values it has are their values. So you're not going to be able to fill in some missing gaps because there are no missing gaps. if there were missing gaps, it would be incomplete. It would not be a complete social movement if there are gaps in its ideology. So, yeah, so long as it is a complete worldview, or at least in the area of life that it applies to, there are no missing gaps. So the argument that just because open source does not talk about the ethics doesn't mean that it's necessarily incompatible with ethics is nonsense, because as a social movement, the values it has are the values it has, and fundamentally you just can't adapt that. In that sense, you cannot mix the two. They don't mix. They are two different movements with fundamentally different core values. They can't be mixed. It's impossible, because they're just different. They are both a complete worldview, at least in that area of life. So the two cannot be merged. Nor should they. So, unfortunately, I see a lot of precedent for this, that the people would want to mix them somehow, like I just mentioned earlier, I've heard it said that there is a lot of mixing between the movements these days, and but that is inherently nonsensical. You see, what is really going on is that, at least in comparison to the open source movement, the free software movement has actually been growing weaker. The open source movement has been taking its place. That is what has been going on, at least relatively so. Whether on absolute scale the free software movement has grown weaker is not what I'm discussing. Relative to the open source movement, it has, so it could be that the free software movement is still growing, but the open source movement is just growing more rapidly. So relatively. And that is what I say has been going on, and this could potentially be disguised as mixing between the movements. There could also be some possibility that former supporters of the free software movement, now supporting the open source movement, could be putting out there this nonsense idea, but I find that more unlikely. It seems more likely to me that this is an attempt by the open source camp to try to co-opt the discussion around the software. You see, the free software movement did come first, and they do still have a relevance out there. And because the two movements are fundamentally incompatible, what open source wants to do is take from the free software movement, take its audience. So therefore, this idea of mixing between the movements and that idea that they work together is therefore put out there as a plot to try to get people who would otherwise support the free software movement to go along with the open source movement. And that is why the open source movement is not only incompatible with the free software movement, but it is also an enemy of the free software movement. Now, on a fundamental level, I acknowledge the fact that the true biggest enemy of the free software movement is, of course, the proprietary software world. That is the true biggest enemy, the biggest problem that we are facing. However, there are also other problems, and the open source movement is actually one of those problems. You see, the open source movement is almost like a parasite that is weakening the free software movement, and it is therefore, in effect, making the free software movement weaker against fighting the proprietary software movement. It's not really a movement. There is no proprietary software movement, but the proprietary software world. So, if the goal of the free software movement is to defeat proprietary software, well, open source is getting in the way of that. And that is why the open source movement is an enemy. Fundamentally on its own, although incompatible, the open source movement is not inherently an enemy of the free software movement. Not by definition, like how the proprietary software world is. Because on a fundamental moral stance of the free software movement is that they stand against the proprietary software. The proprietary software is the central focus as the enemy. The problem to be solved, the enemy to be defeated, that is by definition the big enemy that the free software movement has. But even though it's not written at the core of the free software movement that the open source movement has to be an enemy of the free software movement, the context and the world that exists around us, the environment makes it so that the open source movement actually does become an enemy also. And I say it is absolutely imperative that the supporters of the free software movement recognize this reality, that although the open source movement is not an enemy of the free software movement inherently, the world that exists around us does make it so that the open source movement is our enemy. The open source movement is getting in the way of defeating proprietary software. So if you support the free software movement, or rather you agree with the values of the free software movement, then I say do support the free software movement. Now, it is not true that nothing good can come out of the open source movement. After all, they do still make the same software that the free software movement makes. Software that qualifies as free libre tends to be, for the most part, the vast majority, is also the same software that qualifies as being, quote, open source, unquote. So, therefore, the open source people left alone to do their thing, they are still making software that qualifies as free software. So they are still, in that sense, contributing to the free software world. So again, I want to make this clear, the open source movement is not inherently evil. The reason it's an enemy is because it's getting in the way. Although it does some good, it's also doing harm as well. And I would like to say that we don't need them to do the good. The free software movement can do all the good that it needs to do on its own. By supporting the free software movement, you are already supporting the idea that is necessary to make the free software. So even though the open source movement also makes free software, it also does something bad as well. It's getting in the way, it's bad. So, to support the free software movement, there's very little reason for you to support the open source movement if you don't actually agree with them. Now, if you're someone who doesn't agree with the values of the free software movement, then obviously you just have your views. But I'm talking to the ones who do agree with the values of freedom. If the free software movement's views are what you align with, if that's what you agree with, then that is what you should be supporting, not something else. Even if it somewhat resembles what you actually agree with, if it's not exactly right, if that's not it, then that's not it. If freedom is your core value, then support the social movement that has freedom as its core value. Not the movement that makes a statement by omission that they do not care about freedom. If they cared about freedom, you see, they would have freedom as their core value. And since the open source movement does not have it as their core value, it is making a statement by omission that freedom is not important to them. People who support freedom and people who do not support freedom, people who are actively against freedom, could all the same just as well be in the open source movement. The open source movement itself inherently, fundamentally does not care about freedom. If it did, it would be there in their core values, but it's not. Therefore, you have to recognize that and see that if you want software freedom, then you have to support the movement that actually advocates for software freedom. So, say free software. Say libre software. Wave the banner of the movement that you actually support. And don't let some content creator types on the internet tell you nonsense that, oh, but you can just support the both, oh, we can be friends together. No, we can't. You can't philosophically, fundamentally agree with both at the same time. It doesn't make any sense. Because again, open source as a social movement, it has a set of values. Just like the free software movement has. And they are not the same values. So you cannot agree with both of them at the same time. You cannot agree with the social movement that has freedom as its core value and a social movement that does not, and therefore makes a statement by omission that it does not care about freedom. Those two are fundamentally incompatible. So no, you can't support both the open source movement and the free software movement. Fundamentally. You have to pick one. And I say, you ought to pick the free software movement. And that's it for this speech. Thanks for listening. Until next time, bye.